Good evening, everyone. I have a few announcements before we introduce our speaker. I'm Bill Harbalis. I'm the president of Alachua County Association of Pharmacists. I think about almost 90 people are logged on, so I'll go ahead and get started. First, I wanted to remind everybody about what's become a small project for a lot of pharmacists here in Alachua County, which is the Grace Pharmacy, part of Grace Healthcare Services. This pharmacy was created by a couple of our members and is largely staffed by pharmacists from around our area. They are encouraging everybody to sign up if you'd like to volunteer, be a volunteer pharmacist. There are plenty of people that have done it before who can orient you to the pharmacy. We will also take technicians and interns as well. So if anybody is interested in doing that, please email one of our board members or go ahead onto the gracehealthcs.com website, gracehealthcs.com. If you can't volunteer, they also take donations towards the expenses of the pharmacy. So if anybody is interested in that, please do so. I think the pharmacy in general is becoming very, very successful, and I think we should all want to be a part of it. This weekend, also, I wanted to remind everybody that Joy Wright, one of our members and a very active member of FPA, has put together an FPA local unit leadership summit. This is it's called Building Your Profession Through Leadership, and this is a Zoom meeting that has a number of very good speakers and breakout rooms. Joe Scuro, the president of FPA, will be, for instance, will be giving a session on board liability. We'll also have a Florida legislator, Anna Escamani, will also give a talk. If you're interested in this, it goes from 8:45 in the morning to 1:30 p.m. There's 100 seats. I think we have about 30 or 40 more seats available. If you're interested in that, please also give Joy or me an email, and we'll get you to the right place. Joy's worked pretty hard on this, and so I think it's interesting, especially for young pharmacists interested in leadership activity. For tonight's speaker, I'd like to introduce Dr. Steve Straubing. Dr. Straubing is a physician practicing addiction medicine at Meridian Behavioral Health Care here in Gainesville. He received his medical degree in residency in obstetrics and gynecology from the University of Cincinnati. He received his fellowships in addiction medicine from the University of Florida and the University of South Florida. His clinical responsibilities here at Meridian include inpatient detox unit, office-based residential and partial hospitalization opioid treatment programs, supervision of patients admitted to their PICC line unit from Shands for opioid tapers. That sounds like a lot of fun. He teaches these skills, of course, to medical students, residents, and fellows, and holds appointments at both the University of Florida College of Medicine and the University of Florida College of Medicine. His other areas of interest include treatment of chronic pain in patients with substance use disorders in pregnant women, opiate maintenance therapy using methadone and buprenorphine, and also outreach to and education of primary care physicians on the subject of addiction. In other words, he's got a lot to teach us here this evening. And so we're very happy that he has agreed to come, and we're glad to have you with us, Dr. Straubing, and please welcome.
Thanks a lot, Bill. I was trying to figure out who you were talking about, actually. So just two minor corrections, okay?
Please do.
I was not at University of South Florida. I was in Tampa at a satellite of University of Florida back in 2012. It's called DACO, which is a fairly large nonprofit facility, much like Meridian in Gainesville. And our PICC line unit actually is not meant for opioid taper. We primarily have collaborated with UF for patients that are suffering from endocarditis and osteomyelitis. And these are individuals that come to us after their acute care is over. They continue their antibiotics at Meridian. And we don't generally work on tapering their opioids. We work on giving them appropriate addiction treatment, which in many cases includes methadone or buprenorphine. Just some minor corrections.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
I was
so
digging the best I could.
Presentation up here. Are you guys able to see that okay?
I think it looks pretty clear to me.
All right,
Anybody else?
that's good. All right, let me put it on presentation mode here. There we go.
I'd like to remind everybody that we are monitoring the chat, and we will alert Dr. Straubing if we have any questions or something. We'll try not to interrupt you, but if we have some questions that are pertinent, we might interject.
And I think that's great because I'm looking at this session as really kind of a give and take and improving my education about things that I don't know a whole lot about, which is from the pharmacist point of view. So I was really very excited when Tim Rogers approached me probably about 5 months ago, and asked me if I would consider doing a presentation because I speak to a lot of groups, mostly medical students and residents, but this is the first time that I've actually gotten to talk to pharmacy professionals. So I'm actually looking forward to it.
Well, you're clearly in the middle of it. And so,
What's that?
and you're clearly in the middle of it. So you have much to teach us. I wanted to remind everybody to, after the presentation, to make sure to fill out the review. And at some point during the talk, we will provide you with the code to get CE. So thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Straubing, and I'm gonna butt out now.
Okay. So first of all, my email is down here. If anybody wants to send me an email, I'd be happy to respond to you. Also, if you do have questions, I think Joy is going to kind of moderate those. And at some point, we can maybe have some type of open discussion, especially towards the end. I've got an interesting case for you guys and couple of things that I want to know about. So we'll go ahead and proceed. So this talk is basically a general talk on substance use disorders. And when I came up with this talk, I considered that we exist as a patient pharmacist physician triad. And obviously I'm only 1/3 of the triad. And so I'd like input from you. We don't have any patients attending the session, so we'll kind of be virtual patients, I guess. So I have no relevant financial disclosures. Basic goals of our discussion are to provide education and into some of the considerations of substance use disorders from my perspective. And as I mentioned, I hope to learn from you some of the barriers that you as pharmacists encounter in your daily practices. And hopefully we can find a common ground to best serve our mutual patients and clients. So in order to best achieve these goals, I came up with this framework, and I'm going to define the overarching health, societal, and financial toll that SUDs exact. I'm going to use the abbreviation SUDs a bunch, and that, of course, is substance use disorder. We're going to have a very brief discussion of the neurobiology of addiction, which may in part be review for a lot of you. I want to talk about current trends in substance use in our region, North Central Florida. I also want to do a brief discussion of some of the current treatment modalities for common substance use disorders, and we're going to concentrate on opioid use disorders. I'm going to also talk a little bit about a very difficult topic because it's so complex, and that is the long-term opioid therapy conundrum. And I see this as the pendulum swinging back and forth. And if you've been in medicine or pharmacy nearly as long as I have, you've seen the pendulum swinging back and forth quite a number of times. And as I also mentioned, I want to do some give and take as to what we can do as colleagues to, again, optimally serve our clients. So I think it's important, first of all, to define what addiction is and what addiction is not. So addiction isn't, and we hear these isn'ts a lot, it is not sporadic consequence-free use of substances or behaviors with the potential for abuse. So in other words, if I talk to a patient and they tell me that 5 years ago they smoked some marijuana, I would not term that patient as having a cannabis use disorder. For the same token, somebody goes to a party and has 4 glasses of wine that hardly ever drinks, I would not say, well, that patient has an alcohol use disorder. So the sporadic, hopefully consequence-free use of substances is not necessarily addiction. It could be, but it's usually not. Addiction isn't a failure of willpower. It's not a moral shortcoming. Sign of weakness. It's not a bad behavior, although bad behaviors may result from the addiction process. And it's not a poor choice in life. And I put 2 asterisks by this because I frequently have people come up to me and say, well, don't you think that using drugs is a poor choice? And I do have to answer that in most cases, yeah, it's really a bad choice, but that assumes that the individual was capable of making a good, valid choice. And as we discuss with our residents and students regarding addiction, frequently people go into addiction, and in fact, in most cases, pre-wired for a liability for addiction, both genetically and environmentally and et cetera. The other thing is, I really, in all the years that I've been doing addiction medicine, have yet to meet a person who said, yeah, I thought it'd be a really good idea, a lot of fun to become an addict. So, we do have issues because we are asked, don't you think it's a poor choice in life? And that's my response to that. What is addiction? And I'd like to break addiction down. I'm kind of a reductionist and like to keep things simple. And there are some very complex, long definitions of addiction. But basically, I use the 4 C's of addiction. And the first C is a loss of control over the use of substances. It's a compulsion to use substances despite diminishing rewards. In other words, wanting a substance, but not so much liking the substance, which we do see. Craving for substances, as I mentioned, despite diminishing rewards, and the use of substances despite the potential for or actual adverse consequences. So if you remember those 4 C's, that basically pretty much covers all 11 criteria in the DSM-5, and it also incorporates most fairly complex definitions of addiction. So what are the costs of addiction? 21 million Americans are estimated to have the disease of addiction. That doesn't include tobacco use disorder. 15 million Americans suffer from the disease of alcohol use disorder. At least 3 million Americans suffer from opioid use disorder. And in the several years pre-COVID, at least 88,000 lives per year were lost due to alcohol-related deaths. 50,000 lives were lost due to opioid-related deaths. There were mostly overdoses. And currently we are seeing in some regions of the country more deaths from methamphetamine overdoses than opioid overdoses. Just this morning, somebody threw out the figure that in the last year, and I'm not sure exactly when they stopped counting, whether it was January 1st or not, something that we all thought was going to happen because of the COVID isolation and anxiety, et cetera, that we are now up to, in the last year, about 80,000 opioid overdose deaths, which is kind of coming close to the number of alcohol-related deaths. So all this has causes about $530 billion a year in financial costs. That's $500 billion, and that happens to be 6% of our gross national product, which is pretty astounding to me. And of course, there's incalculable costs from the disruption of families, productivity, subsequent downward drift. And by that, I mean just the continuing decrease in function in all domains of life, which is definitely something that does occur to most patients after a while as they get into their addiction. So I want to cover really basically, very basically, the neurobiology of addiction. And then at the end of this very short discussion, I will recommend a reading, which is really a great reading. I strongly encourage you to read it. It's really easy to read. But essentially, we need 3 very basic things to survive. We need food, whether you want that kind of food or something a little bit healthier. We need water, and we need what's on this woman's tattoo. So hopefully some of you are enough chemists to realize that this is dopamine. Okay. I don't know who was able to pick that up before I put that on, but that's dopamine. And I want to talk about dopamine a little bit, because dopamine is one of the critical neurotransmitters in our brain. It does a number of very important functions. It helps us learn. It helps motivate us. It helps reward us on an evolutionary level by increasing the likelihood of increasing our species. So obviously, anything that is rewarding and enjoyable, we are likely to want to repeat. And some of the things that are enjoyable enhance the ability to reproduce our species. On a day-to-day basis, adequate dopamine levels determine whether we get on just veg. And dopamine exists in kind of a Goldilocks zone, not too much, not too little, just right. It exerts differing effects in different parts of the brain, and I'm sure you folks dispense a lot of Parkinsonian drugs. That's related to too little dopamine in the substantia nigra in the brain. If your dopamine is too low in certain cortical parts of the brain, you have difficulty with cognition. In the area of the reward centers of the brain, too little, you just basically want to lie there doing nothing. And as I kind of suggested in a couple of slides ago, there are some people who go through life with pre-existing deficits of dopamine. And I'm sure you've all seen these people. Hopefully you're not one of those people, but we all know them. And these are individuals that go through life with the glass half empty. These are people that kind of remind me of Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh. People that when you talk to them, they just go through life just kind of going through the motions. And many of these individuals have low dopamine tone. They may have it genetically, they may have it environmentally through poor nurturing. It's the nature versus nurture. And unfortunately, nature frequently combines with nurture to make the situation even more troubling. So somebody did some pretty interesting experiments a few years ago where they actually measured dopamine levels in the reward center of the brain. And they did this with subhuman primates. And then they were able to extrapolate those values to human beings. And they came up with some very interesting figures. And we know that we live day to day in a very narrow dopamine range in our brain. By the way, you cannot measure a blood dopamine and have it really reflect what's going on in the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. So most of us require 50 nanograms per deciliter of dopamine on a normal day just to get us out of bed and go about our normal activities, go to work, go to school, etc. If we drop down to 40, we essentially just want to hang out in our PJs all day and watch TV. On your best day ever, you won the lottery, you got a call that you won the Nobel Prize, you had your best time ever in a marathon, all in the same day, you peak up to about 100 nanograms per deciliter. With a good meal, you're at about 94. Sex, unfortunately, is less than a good meal, it's 92. And I don't know if you combine sex while eating a really gourmet meal, if that perks up your dopamine or not. I don't think it's been done. So what happens when we use drugs? Methamphetamine is king of the hill. So remember I said on your best day ever, you get to 100 nanograms per deciliter. A hit of methamphetamine raises you to 1,100 nanograms per deciliter, or more than 10 times the level of your best day ever. All of the other drugs of abuse increase dopamine levels to a lesser degree, usually somewhere in the hundreds. So in other words, we can say that drugs hijack the normal reward system and stimulate the reward areas that are supposed to be there to supraphysiologic levels. But unfortunately, this results in a few bad things occurring. It alters our receptors, so more drug is required for the same reward. We know this very well as tolerance. Again, wanting the drug, but not getting the same reward. So there is less reward from normally rewarding activities. So if your dopamine levels are dropping down to the 10 to 20 range, just normal activities, which may, in other situations, be rewarding, they're really pretty blah. So we see individuals with addiction who just basically don't want to do anything when they are not using their drugs of abuse. They are really in very dire straits, and that has significant importance when we're trying to treat those individuals, because trying to motivate somebody whose dopamine level is 10 to 20 nanograms is not the easiest thing in the world to do. So we also see long-term learning of subconscious predictors of reward, and we call that incentive salience. It's also the same as habit formations and learning cues. These are very firmly and deeply entrenched in your brain. They're memories, they're synapses, and these do not generally go away for the life of the individual. What we do try in treatment is to build up other rewarding memories and synapse, which may hopefully at some point override the incentive salience. And low dopamine levels trigger an almost uncontrollable survival response. This next slide is a graphic representation of that. If we have lack of dopamine, we have craving. And if it gets bad enough, we go into survival mode, and that often leads us to primal action. Another very interesting experiment, this time with humans, a number of years ago, they took 3 groups of individuals, and one group, they basically gave them no fluids for 3 days. Apparently the investigational review board was thinking, we believe we may have done the wrong thing. Please finish your study because we don't want anybody dying. But in any event, they took these individuals who had basically not had fluid for 3 days. They put in an MRI scanner and they dropped water on their feet, and they kind of showed them pictures of waterfalls, and they looked at what their dopamine response was while they were in survival mode. And they estimated the size of their reward area would have been essentially the size of baseball. Okay, they did the exact same experiment, but this time they did not feed people for 5 days. They started IVs on them, they kept them hydrated, and they didn't feed them for 5 days. They put them in the MRI, they sent in odors of their favorite foods. This is pretty inhumane as far as I'm concerned, but they wanted to see what would happen. And they built a picture in the reward center of an area that was about the size of a baseball, relatively. Then they did the same thing with people who had been abstinent from methamphetamine for a month. And they had the individuals talk about their experience with methamphetamine, their cravings, and they looked at their reward center deep down in the brain. And that area was essentially relatively the size of a baseball field. So you can see how that can be a really, really potent motivator to go get drugs, even if you want to stop using that drug. These are some of the things that we encounter in addiction. So that's really, obviously, the whole area of neurobiology of addiction, a lot more complicated than that. And I kind of focused on dopamine because it does make the world go round. But I would strongly recommend this. This is a free presentation. It came out in 2016. It's was sponsored by SAMHSA, and it was basically the Surgeon General's report on alcohol, drugs, and health. It's about a 120-page monograph. You can get it from this link. And chapter 2 is a wonderful chapter on the neurobiology of addiction. It's really easy to read. It's mandatory reading for our third-year med students who come to us from UF. So let's move on to something else. Are there any questions at this point?
No, we haven't had any in the chat yet.
Okay. All right, let's move on then. Okay, so I want to talk about trends in drug use in North Central Florida. This is obviously a topic of importance for all of us. So what we've seen is that alcohol use has been on an upwards trajectory in the age of COVID and has become somewhat of an orphan stepchild as we've really concentrated everything on opioid overdoses. And I really don't like this term, but I'll use it, the opioid epidemic, because I don't know that it should be characterized as an epidemic, because I think that it's been an upward trend rather than an epidemic. But basically, and you probably have noticed it yourself, if you go into a liquor store, I do this actually, I go in and I ask the salesperson, by the way, have you guys been selling more alcohol in the last year? And I don't go into liquor stores very often, but when I do, they tell me that, yeah, we have been selling so much alcohol. So unfortunately, we're not paying attention to a disorder that's resulting in the death of at least 85 to 90,000 Americans a year. So, and I'm sure you're seeing this, we're seeing significantly less prescription opioid use. And everybody knows, all of you guys know as well as I do, that people are prescribing much, much less, especially here in Florida, where we do have limitations on how much we can prescribe. So you're probably seeing a lot less Vicodin and a lot less Percocet, et cetera. As a result, what we're seeing are huge increases in synthetic opioid use. These are fentanyl primarily and the analogs. We have not seen any carfentanil in our area, but I do see acetyl fentanyl, and that's the other primary one that we see. So I would say right now, probably at least 80% and maybe approaching 90% of the heroin supply is adulterated with fentanyl, and a lot of it's just plain straight fentanyl. It's adulterating it or masquerading as heroin. And unfortunately, we're also seeing fentanyl show up in methamphetamine and also as counterfeit Xanax. I had the opportunity to talk to a couple of DEA agents last week and kind of picking their brain a little bit. And there are a lot of people pressing counterfeit Xanax. I had a patient last week who had tested positive for alprazolam, and she also tested for very large titer of hydromorphone. And when I talked to her, she said, yeah, I did use the Xanax, but I absolutely didn't use it a lot. She happens to be on methadone, so I kind of believe her. And I asked her how it felt. She said, it definitely did not feel like Xanax alone. It felt like Xanax and an opioid. So I think we're starting to see some hydromorphone in our counterfeit Xanax. Of great concern to me and everybody else who's doing this is methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, again, in my discussion with the DEA folks, is almost all coming from Breaking Bad type labs in Mexico. It's being produced via the P2P method, which does not use pseudoephedrine. It uses P2P, which I think is phen-2-propamine and methylamine. And it's a lot more complex of a synthetic process, but that's what they're using, because even in those labs, it's hard to get a hold of a large amount of Sudafed. So we're not seeing any kitchen meth these days, or shake and bake, used to be called. And I kind of think in a way, this may be accidentally iatrogenic, because you can't get a whole lot of a Sudafed anymore. On the other hand, we're also not seeing methamphetamine shake and bake burns. I used to have patients come in who were blind. And how did you get blind? Oh, well, my campfire exploded. And most of the time their campfire exploded because they happened to be doing some shake and bake meth over the campfire. Cocaine, it's still around, but it's been overtaken by methamphetamine. I would mention a fair amount of individuals still using cocaine via various routes, and a lot of them also drink at the same time. When you concurrently drink and use cocaine, your body does a little esterification reaction and produces cocaethylene, and cocaethylene is incredibly cardiotoxic. We're not seeing too many of the cathinones, bath salts, Flocka, Anna, and all those analogs that we were seeing probably about 5 years ago, primarily, I think, because methamphetamine is so readily available and so inexpensive. Cannabis use currently rampant. What we are seeing, because of the cultivars of cannabis that have a great deal more THC to CBD ratio, and CBD is a little bit of an anxiolytic, that people are having a lot of panic attacks, and they're showing up in emergency rooms feeling like they're having heart attacks. So cannabis use is rampant. My prediction is that probably within about 5 years or less, recreational marijuana will probably be legal in Florida. So this from some very nice publications from the Department of Justice, Drug Diversion, DEA folks. They publish a really nice, very, very complete report every year of trends in drug use, and everybody hates to look at slides with graphs, but I wanted to show you how the amount of methamphetamine showing up at forensic labs is greatly outweighing other opioids. So this looked at forensic labs in 4 regions of the country. The yellow is us in the South. And if you look at the y-axis of the graph, I drew a little blue line here. So in 2019, there were about 180 per 100,000 samples of methamphetamine that came to the labs, the forensic labs in the South, versus about 9 per 100,000 for hydrocodone. So the methamphetamine is starting really to lead the league. There is a graph with heroin. Heroin is up a little bit higher, but this methamphetamine can't overemphasize how much we're seeing. Maybe you can fill me in after this. I know there is a pharmaceutical version of methamphetamine. I think it's called Digoxin. I don't know if anybody prescribes it anymore, so maybe somebody can let me know about that. Let's talk about treatment. Let me get a look at the time here. Got plenty of time. So let's talk about treatment for various substance use disorders. Let's talk about treatment for opioid use disorder. First, that's the one that I'm more involved with on a day-to-day basis at Meridian. And we have two really great pharmacotherapies that very quickly stabilize the low dopamine levels seen in abstention from opioids in at least 75% of cases. And those two, as we'll talk about, are methadone and buprenorphine. And a question that I frequently get from patients and occasionally healthcare professionals and patients' families is the following. Aren't we substituting one addiction for another when we use methadone and buprenorphine for maintenance treatment? Why or why not? And maybe we can discuss this a little bit when I'm done with the initial didactic portion of the presentation, because it's a very important question. So we've used methadone since 1970 for opioid use disorder, and this is when the government looked at the pilot methadone projects that were going on in New York City and decided that it was very effective, and they started to open regulated methadone clinics, or OTPs, opioid treatment programs, which are very much the same as they were in 1970. So methadone, we know, is very effective. It reduces morbidity and mortality from opioid use disorder by at least 50%. And the downsides are that it must be used in a highly regulated clinic environment. And also methadone, as you know, is a fairly squirrely drug, a lot of drug-drug interactions, a lot of potential interactions with electrolytes, all sorts of potential problems. So those of us that are using methadone in an OTP really have to have a pretty good understanding of its pharmacology. And unfortunately, you don't have to get any extra training to work in a methadone clinic. As you know, you have to have a special waiver to use buprenorphine. You don't need it to work in an OTP, which always has been kind of astonishing to me. So Mr. Rogers, Tim Rogers, asked me if I would give you a short discussion of our typical day in an OTP in Gainesville. So I'm gonna kind of move to the next slide and then go back. And this is basically where most of the action happens in our methadone clinic. We have in our OTP in Gainesville approximately 325 patients. We are the only methadone clinic in Gainesville. We have a satellite location in Columbia County in Lake City, and we also have a smaller operation in Chiefland. And I kind of supervise the Chiefland clinic also from a medical standpoint. But this is our dosing room, and we have a dosing window over here, and there's one over here. And when a patient comes in, we identify them positively with an ID, and we have special software which shows their methadone dosage. The normal range of dosing for methadone is 80 to 120 milligrams. And we dispense the methadone in one of these plastic cups. We dilute it a little bit. We primarily use liquid methadone. It also, I think, comes in green, but I've never seen it. Ours is kind of a red, supposedly cherry flavored. Obviously, I really don't know from personal experience. But these little pumps here measure out the methadone, and we can titrate it plus or minus 1 milligram. So the liquid allows us a lot of flexibility as far as dosing. These are 10,000 milligram bottles, 10 milligrams per cc. Very few of our patients are on orally dissolvable methadone diskettes, which are 40 milligram orally dissolving, disintegrating tablets. If they were to have an allergy to red dye number 1 or some other GI problem that wouldn't let them use it. But the average patient gets their methadone. If they get a take home, and our patients can earn take homes if they are compliant in the clinic and they've been within the clinic for a varying length of time, and they do what we call phasing up. And when you phase up, you may get up to 6 take-homes, come in once a week, dose in the clinic, and get 6 little take-home bottles. Each take-home bottle goes an individual little plastic bottle. You can kind of see one of the caps from that over here. And the caps have a foil on the inside of them. What we do is we use this device here, which heat seals the foil onto the top of the bottle. So that allows us some degree of diversion protection, because we can have our patients come in if we want to, and we occasionally do this randomly, and have them present their bottles and make sure that there are not any bottles that are open that should not have been opened. So my day in methadone clinic usually starts about 8 in the morning. We start dosing at 6:30 in the morning, and it runs till about 10:30 in the morning. And I primarily see patients that are new to our clinic, and I usually have about 3 new patients a week. And I also see patients who are having problems. The most common problem are aberrancies on their urine drug screens, which we do. We are mandated to do 8 random urine toxicologies a year. And there is flexibility in that. So I see those patients. I see pregnant patients on methadone every month during their pregnancy. And the government regulates that even a patient is doing great, they have to see the physician yearly for a basic health check and a brief physical exam. So that's primarily our methadone clinic. I've worked in one other methadone clinic down in Tampa, which was a much larger clinic. We had about 800 patients. Basically, we did things exactly the same way, but we had 4 dosing windows. And the government basically spells out how many dosing windows you'll have for the number of clients, your client counselor ratio. I should mention also that patients have mandated behavioral therapy also with our professional counselors. So let me go back here. And let me talk briefly about buprenorphine. It's been available for opioid use treatment since the Data 2000 Act, which came out in 2000. It's very safe. It's very effective. It's hard to overdose somebody on buprenorphine unless you're combining it with a benzo or a drug like that. And even then, it's kind of difficult to do. One of the biggest problems that we see, and you probably see more of it than I do, is diversion. And the Drug Enforcement Administration wants us to have in place, me as a practitioner in my clinic, a diversion protocol. And they actually visited me for a couple of months ago for a routine audit. And one of the things they wanted to talk about was what I had in place to help limit diversion. There is no way, as you're probably aware, that we're going to eliminate diversion. But we can do a lot to lessen the degree of diversion. And I think lessening the degree of diversion will help to reduce the stigma that we see a lot in individuals who are on buprenorphine. And we're going to talk about that stigma a little bit later on. I was going to give you a short discussion of a typical day in our buprenorphine clinic, but it's pretty much routine. Patients that are doing well come in monthly. As you know, it's a Schedule III drug. I could give refills on it, but we do require our patients to get monthly individual and group counseling. I see all of the patients, and when I first joined Meridian about 7 years ago, there was only one other dispenser, one other prescriber of buprenorphine. That was Dr. Abernathy. You might have seen his prescriptions. And we now have 3 full-time doctors, 2 PRN doctors, and we have about 5 nurse practitioners. So there is a lot of availability. I'm waivered for 275 patients. Because of infrastructural problems, I see about 100 patients, but I could see up to 275. So the third agent that is approved by the FDA for opioid use disorder is naltrexone, which, as you know, is a full antagonist at the opioid receptor. It comes in two forms, and you're probably aware of this also: a depot injectable form, brand name being Vivitrol, and also an oral form. I think one of the brand names is Revia. Revia is very inexpensive, and Vivitrol is very expensive. It's about $1,200 to $1,500 a month. We are fortunate that we have a grant from the state of Florida that we are able to provide it free to most of our patients from the company that manufactures it. It appears the oral medication appears to work better in more motivated patients. It's kind of like if you wanted to use a drug, you just would not take your oral naltrexone. So we see it working better in motivated patients, and a good example of a well-motivated patient would be a professional in recovery, a med student, physician, nurse, pharmacist, etc. And in fact, I'm not sure about the pharmacy board, but the Department of Health, the medical board, would prefer a physician to be on Vivitrol as opposed to buprenorphine. But actually, there are a few physicians who are on buprenorphine, and I spoke to the director of whoever monitors physicians. I think it's PRN that monitors. Spoke to her last year, and I think there's actually several pharmacists that are on methadone. So I wasn't even aware of that till I spoke with her. We also utilize behavioral therapy. Behavioral therapy is effective in many, and it works much better in association with methadone and or buprenorphine. Okay. By the way, naltrexone, Vivitrol is probably not as effective as either buprenorphine or methadone. One of the issues with naltrexone is that you have to be off opioids probably for about 12 to 14 days before you do that, so you don't precipitate withdrawal. And unfortunately, there are a lot of patients that cannot maintain abstinence for that 12 to 14-day period. So that limits the number of people that can use Vivitrol. They have talked about in various criminal justice systems employing Vivitrol during incarceration for when the patient decarcerates. And in Rhode Island, when they started to do that, they actually noticed a 60% decrease in mortality after the inmate was released. And that mortality decrease was decreased overdoses. So many times a patient will be incarcerated for a period of time. They'll lose all their tolerance. They'll leave the incarceration, and they'll start to use the same substance they were using previously, which in many cases now is fentanyl, and they're dying of overdoses. Patients that were started on Vivitrol actually appear to do much better, and there's been a trend towards utilizing medication-assisted treatment in criminal justice system. So there's a lot of alternative therapies. Ibogaine, if you're aware of that, it's kind of a hallucinogenic herbal or medication. It's not legally available in the United States. I think there's a couple offshore in the Caribbean. People do these, what do you call it? Detoxification tours, you know. So I've heard positive and negative things about Ibogaine. There's also some Chinese herbal medication. I gave a lecture to a group on non-pharmacologic therapies, and you know, there are no good randomized controlled studies on these, but anecdotally they're interesting. And there are other modalities that are being looked at currently: transcranial stimulation, There's also currently some experiments being done with deep brain stimulation. I think there's about 5 or 6 people in the country that are currently undergoing DBS for basically intractable addiction that has responded to no other modality. All right. So let's talk about treatment for alcohol use disorder. Pharmacotherapy is used both FDA approved and off-label, can be a very effective adjunct. We'll talk about naltrexone again. It's also available in the form of Vivitrol and the oral naltrexone, usually 50 milligrams per day. The studies with Vivitrol basically looked at not abstinence, but increase in time to return to heavy drinking. And they did not follow these patients out longitudinally more than about a year, okay? There is a very interesting method, Sinclair method. Dr. Sinclair was an American psychologist, neuroscientist who did his work in Finland, and he used oral naltrexone in a very interesting fashion. He felt that people started to re-drink because they were conditioned to do so. And his theory was to extinguish that conditioning effect. And the way that he did that was tell a patient to take 50 milligrams of oral naltrexone 1 hour prior to drinking. And he encouraged them to drink. And what happened with, obviously, the naltrexone being an antagonist, they were not getting a buzz from their alcohol. They were getting everything else, like vomiting and running into walls and stuff. And after a while, what Dr. Sinclair found was that the vast majority of his patients started to actually seriously diminish their alcohol intake, and in some cases became totally abstinent. So the Sinclair method is still used pretty widely in Europe. I actually like the concept behind it, but because I am able to give my patients injectable naltrexone, I really have not had the opportunity to do this. But if you ever read about Sinclair method, it's really kind of interesting. So acamprosate, Camprel, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. The action is felt to be glutamatergic, in other words, simulating alcohol effect at the NMDA receptor. It's pretty expensive. You might know the price better than I do. It's got a weird dosing schedule of, I think, 666 milligrams TID. I've had very little personal professional experience with the drug. I used it a few times when I was a fellow at UF, and quite honestly, I've not used it since I got out of fellowship about 6 years ago. Our old friend Antabuse disulfiram, I've actually used it for only 2 patients with alcohol use disorder. Theoretically, it's very useful in highly motivated patients, or if you can actually monitor administration. We have actually used disulfiram for cocaine abuse off-label, because disulfiram is a beta hydroxylase inhibitor. So it actually increases dopamine levels, and which is why you don't want to use it in a patient with psychosis. But some individuals have noticed, because of the increase in dopamine, that they actually have decreased craving. Anecdotally, I've used it in about 5 patients. 4 of them said they thought it was helpful. My understanding right now is disulfiram is difficult to get a hold of. So a bunch of off-label drugs that have been used with varying degrees of success. Gabapentin, which is good, as you know, for everything or nothing. Topiramate, varenicline has been used with actually some pretty good results, because alcohol also works through acetylcholine receptors. Baclofen, which is a GABA B drug. Ondansetron. All these have been used off-label with varying results. Ondansetron has turned out to be useful in a subset of individuals with alcohol who have various types of point mutations in their genome. So they're actually doing, there's a drug company doing a lot of big time research on dansitron for alcohol use disorder. Gabapentin, if we use it, best used 1,800 milligrams a day and above. So we also utilize and encourage, where appropriate, formal behavioral therapy, also mutual support. AA, everybody knows the 12 steps. Smart recovery is another one that's not as widely available, but is more CBT versus spiritual approach. Church, family, supportive friends, all may be of significant value in association with consideration for pharmacotherapy. I would say that in my experience, and I think most of the literature also bears this out, pharmacotherapy for alcohol is more adjunctive than super useful. And that's, I think, because alcohol is what we term as a promiscuous drug. In other words, it works through pretty much every receptor in the brain. So if you just knock out the opioid receptors, you still have your serotonin receptors, acetylcholine receptors, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Also very important to treat psychiatric comorbidity. Self-medication, which we see a lot of, may result in alcohol and other drug misuse. So we frequently have seen people who have an anxiety disorder, they have PTSD, they have major depressive disorder, and a lot of these dopamine bursters like alcohol and opioids and cocaine are extremely effective in the very short term in getting these individuals out of their low dopamine tone. And in the case of anxiety, cocaine and methamphetamine are not very good, but definitely opioids and alcohol. Again, in the short term, and many people are unable or unwilling to access adequate medical treatment and do the self-medication route, and they wind up getting into problems that they didn't intend to. I want to talk briefly about stimulant use disorder. Unfortunately, we don't have any good pharmacotherapy for stimulant use disorders. The mainstay of treatment currently involves behavioral therapy, and the only significantly efficacious form of behavioral therapy is contingency management. And contingency management, I'll briefly explain it. It's a form of conditioning. And in this form of conditioning, the therapist delineates or designates a goal behavior. And in the case of stimulant use disorder, obviously the goal that we wish to achieve is decreased use of stimulants. If the patient then comes in and gives us a negative drug screen for, let's say, methamphetamine, that patient may get or will get a non-monetary reward. For instance, $10 voucher for Publix. If they give us 2, we give them 2 vouchers, maybe worth $20. So we're not talking about big money. This has been shown even after the end of the contingency management portion of the program to have a latency effect. It's persistent. And there's a lot of good literature on contingency management. I will tell you what the biggest problem with contingency management is. Individuals who hold the purse strings are generally very loath to, in their words, pay people not to use drugs, okay? And that is what we hear. And my response to that is, from a utilitarian standpoint, it's a lot cheaper to pay maybe $100 worth of rewards versus $100,000 later on to take care of their endocarditis or osteomyelitis or MIs or strokes, etc. But contingency management not utilized enough, primarily because of systemic issues. So you might say, well, since dopamine levels are very low, as we talked about in the post-drug use phase, why don't we use a dopaminergic drug? Unfortunately, most of them have been tried and the results have been really disappointing. Most dopaminergic drugs would have to be used in doses far above approved levels, would lead to lots of side effects. People have used anti-Parkinsonian drugs. Wellbutrin, bupropion, is one that has been used a lot, and the results have not been very good. People have tried alternate stimulants like modafinil, and that doesn't appear to work very well. The current one that a lot of us are trying is mirtazapine, which does lots of things, but it also tends to increase dopamine. And in certain populations, this has actually been shown to be of value. The certain population, the LGTB communities, where they have looked a lot at mirtazapine for methamphetamine. I've given it to a few of my patients, and I've not been overwhelmed with how well it works. So we as addictionologists are anxious for a better pharmacotherapeutic option, because what we are seeing is basically a whack-a-mole game where we're starting to have a beneficial effect on the opioid situation, kind of, but methamphetamine is definitely rearing its ugly head, and we don't have any good treatments. And I will tell you that in my methadone clinic, I would hazard a guess that probably 20 to 25% of our random drug screens are positive for methamphetamine. And of the positive drug screens, which are mostly polysubstance situations, probably 80% of them also have methamphetamine. And the methamphetamine we're seeing is over 99% D-methamphetamine. So the D isomer is the really potent isomer, and what they're doing is they're producing L or racemic methamphetamine, and what they're doing is enantiomeric procedures to kind of get rid of the L and turn it mainly into D-meth. So it's pretty complicated. This is Breaking Bad stuff. Let's talk briefly about sedative use disorder. We are primarily seeing short-acting benzos complicating other use disorders. So it's relatively rare to see just a benzo or other sedative disorder. Usually exists in combination with other drugs of abuse. As I mentioned, pretty rare. We also occasionally see non-benzo sedative use disorders in the form of carisoprodol, our famous Soma, which I don't think should be on the market anymore. And a lot of docs I've noticed just love to prescribe Soma. You probably, maybe you do see that, maybe you don't. I hope you don't see it, but looking at E-forces all day, I see a lot of Soma, lots of Soma. We rarely see barbiturates these days, and most of what I see is butalbital from somebody using Fioricet. So treatment involves medical management in the acute phase, and we usually switch our patients from a short-acting benzo to a long-acting benzo like clonazepam. Some docs use phenobarb. I don't, just because I trained on using Klonopin. Anticonvulsants, your anticonvulsant du jour can be used to help prevent seizures, and also there's usually an anxiolytic effect for most anticonvulsants. Some people I've seen have actually combined something like Tegretol and Klonopin. They use less Klonopin. So the acute phase where we're trying to prevent seizure, very, very straightforward. It's really easy to do. Should be medically managed, but preventing a return to benzos is exceptionally difficult. It probably is the most difficult detox that we have long-term. And we really have to utilize a full court press with a very slow gradual taper. And I'm talking like 8 to 10 months, slowly every week, decreasing the Klonopin dose as well. And you have to do this, treating the underlying psychiatric issues in a very intensive fashion. So if you just say to somebody with an anxiety disorder who is now rebounding because they're getting off Xanax, say, hey, it'll get better. That's an individual that's suffering. And unless you address the other, their anxiety disorder in another fashion, I can almost guarantee you they're going to be getting Xanax. And if they can't find a doc that's going to give them alprazolam, they're going to go out there and maybe get counterfeit alprazolam, which has a little fentanyl, and then they're going to die. It's a problem. We're also seeing an increase in GHB abuse. The treatment is similar to benzo abuse. We use benzos in pretty high doses for long term. This is like benzo detox on steroids. As I mentioned, alprazolam, by far the most overprescribed control drug that I see on review of eForce. And unfortunately, many docs prescribe, many patients are co-prescribed both opioids, and by another doctor, they're given alprazolam. And it's kind of the law now that if I'm going to prescribe a controlled substance, I've got to look at the eForce. I'm kind of wondering whether doctors are just ignoring it, don't care, or what is the problem. But probably every day I see a doctor prescribing carisoprodol, another doctor giving 120 1 milligram alprazolam, and another doc giving 125 milligram Percocet. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but obviously not a good situation, right? Okay, so this is the magic code that I was asked to put in. So if you want continuing education credit, you need to enter 911 on your evaluation, all right? So now we kind of come to the collaborative portion of the talk, and we're down about an hour. I have a really good idea. Since we covered a lot of stuff, how about if we take a 5-minute break, it's 8 o'clock now, and reconvene at about 8:05, if that's okay? Is that all right, Joy?
Yes, that would be lovely.
Okay, so 8:05. Okay, we'll get started in about 30 seconds here. All right, we'll get restarted here. On the top of my screen here, I have the number of participants, which is 114. I was kind of anxious to see if after I gave the code, whether this started to go down, and it's really cool that it didn't go down. So that's okay. I know most of the, what's that?
A question did come in during the break.
Yeah.
And a pharmacist is asking, how, if at all, do you staff your patients? How do you involve pharmacists? Do you verify prescription fills with usage for compliance? Like, do you call the pharmacy and see if the patient actually picked up anything that's not controlled that you can't see on their e-force?
No, I generally do not do that. And I don't do it primarily because of a time factor. I do look for all my buprenorphine patients. One of the things we obviously do is look at their e-force. I do ask the patient if they're using any additional medications. Probably the uncontrolled medication that I see people using in the largest amount, either by prescription or buying on the illicit market, is, and I'm sure that's not going to be a surprise to you, gabapentin. And we actually started testing for gabapentin probably about 4 years ago in our methadone clinic. And I would say probably 25% of our patients were using gabapentin. So no, it would be great if somehow we could get a hold of that, because obviously there are some non-controlled medications that may have interactions. The drug that I worry about most with drug-drug interactions is methadone. And one of the requirements for our patients is that they bring in anything that is prescribed for them. If they don't, there are some fairly mild sanctions, but we felt it was really important to know what people are taking. So that is a requirement in our OTP clinic, not so much in our buprenorphine clinic, because I don't think it's probably as much of a safety factor. Hopefully that answers the question. So the second part is really to help stimulate give and take interaction between you folks and me. And I jumped ahead a few slides, and I'm going to go back to the other slides. But about a week and a half ago, I ran into a palliative care physician who's in a different state, and she had posted a case on Twitter that I follow, and it was an interesting case. And I actually contacted her and asked her if she would mind if I presented this case, because I thought it was kind of interesting and may help stimulate some conversation. So this is a board certified internist, and she also is board certified in palliative care. She is not in Florida. So the patient is a 92-year-old female with metastatic papillary thyroid cancer. The tumor encased the vasculature and nerves of the right neck. She was not a candidate for surgery, radiation, or chemotherapy, given the advanced nature of the tumor, its location, and her age. OTC analgesics were not adequate. The patient was in severe pain, and she was started on oxycodone 5 milligrams Q4 hours PRN pain. The patient was using a BID, and it did provide short-term relief, but was also sedating. The palliative care specialist then prescribed methadone 2.5 milligrams BID, which she told me she frequently uses to target both the NMDA receptor and the mu opioid receptor. And that's kind of unique for methadone, and it's a good thing about methadone. And that was in addition to the 5 milligrams of oxycodone to be used as a breakthrough agent. The patient's family brought the 2 prescriptions to a large chain pharmacy. And the question for you folks is, as a pharmacist, what would be your response to these prescriptions? And a little bit later, I want to do some of these other slides. We can, if you'd like to discuss that. And if you want, I'll tell you what the response was in, I believe it was New York, that this physician and patient were located. So let me go back here a little bit. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about at this point was what this talk really is about. How can we optimize the physician, patient, pharmacist triad? And I think actually this may be the most important part, at least for me, this presentation, because obviously I only represent one part of the triad. So what are the barriers to optimization that the patient faces? What do you see as barriers? What are the barriers to optimization that you as a pharmacist faces? And what are the barriers that I as a physician face? And obviously this is the only one that I can really speak to based on my direct experience. So first I want to talk about my perceptions are based on the barriers that I see, and some things that I've noted in my own practice over the last few years. So one of the things that I'm continuing to work on is approaching my patients who are less than compliant in a really non-judgmental fashion, knowing what I know now about the addictive process and the primal urge to use drugs and low neurotransmitter levels, et cetera, et cetera. And I will say that at one time early in my practice, I did approach things in a more judgmental fashion, and that frequently put me at in a confrontational situation with the patient, which I found out over a period of 1 year to 2 years as I evolved at Meridian to be a very counterproductive collaboration or therapeutic alliance with the patient. So, but I continue to work on it. I think I'm pretty much where I want to be with that. And I continue to work on collaboration with my patients, developing a mutually accepted treatment plan, which allows both of us, the patient and myself, our own autonomy, and also my boundaries for safe practice. So there are definitely boundaries that I had to put in place, beyond which I really could not go because of my concerns over safe prescribing of medication. We all know there are some patients who are solely there in my office and probably in your pharmacies to get medications to divert for financial gain. And trying to prevent that to best of my ability sometimes makes me play 2 roles, both as a physician and detective. And this is an extremely difficult dual relationship for me. And you know, we all have other stakeholders and regulators, and that provides some barriers for me, and I'm sure for you too. And all these things have to be, it's like walking a tightrope. So and to further that issue, I continue to struggle with encroachment on my practice and prescribing ideals by other stakeholders who may exert subtle, or in some cases, not so subtle pressure to alter my practice. And I'd really like to hear what I'm sure are similar problems that you folks have, because I don't think it applies just to me as a physician.
So there's one comment and two questions in the chat.
Go ahead.
So the comment is from Jeff, and he says, having worked both hospital and retail, pharmacists in retail have access to much less information than is possible. Pharmacists can make better decisions when they have more complete patient information.
And that's very valid. And quite honestly, if I had more information about maybe a non-controlled medication that the patient is getting, that's not going to hurt my practice. The only question that I would have is, how do we implement that? Communication is difficult. I do occasionally call pharmacies to find out if a patient in fact picked up their medication or not. I have run into situations where things have either not been loaded up to the eForce, or occasionally they entered in a different name and actually the patient did get it and it didn't show up on that particular patient's eForce. So there are problems, occasional problems there. And also I have a fair amount of difficulty occasionally being on hold, as we all do, with all the prompts at pharmacies to speak to a pharmacist. Now, I do have some ancillary individuals in my office who are also very busy, and so it's difficult. And I would certainly love, as part of our discussion, to hear ways that you all see that we could implement that. When I worked at UF, we had very close collaboration with our hospital pharmacists. They would call me all the time and say, by the way, did you know that you're prescribing this? And it does have a rare interaction with that. And they would call me sometimes 4 or 5 times a day when I was a fellow, and I actually appreciate it most of the time. So I think a hospital-based setting, very much different than a commercial or retail pharmacy situation. So maybe we can respond to that. And you said you had a couple of questions.
Yeah. One is, do you have your patients sign a narcotic contract?
We have our patients sign a treatment agreement. And I really, really never use the word contract, because when you say contract, you have set up a legal fiduciary document. And I have been advised by a number of physicians, never, ever, ever call it a contract. We do have a expectation of what the patient can expect, our responsibilities and their responsibilities. And these are available. You can get them all over the internet, and it's pretty much the standard. You should go to one pharmacy, and you can expect to occasionally be called to come in to present your pills so we can do a pill count, et cetera. So yes, we do have them sign an agreement, both in our methadone clinic and buprenorphine clinic.
Another question was, how do you treat constipation from opioid use disorder?
Very good question. So with buprenorphine, I really don't run into major, you said constipation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We really haven't had much of a problem with constipation on buprenorphine, despite what the folks were trying to sell Bonavail. I think that was one of their big selling points, was doesn't produce as much constipation. Usually for those on buprenorphine, since I very rarely hear about it, just OTC laxatives. Methadone, definitely a different situation. And a few of our patients really have difficulty. We have occasionally used lactulose, and we certainly recommend a high fiber diet, and Senna occasionally. One of the problems that we do see actually more frequently with both buprenorphine and methadone is hyperhidrosis, sweating. And you do not develop a tolerance to the sweating either. And I use a lot of oxybutynin, Detrol, for those patients. It works great, like 5 milligrams daily. So it can be a problem. We talk to patients up front about our methadone patients primarily.
And another one is, why is there so much diversion of the Subutex? Is there some sort of high that they're getting from the Subutex?
That's a very interesting question, and that actually has been looked into. There's a physician at University of Kentucky, Michelle Lofwall, who's written a lot on that. And when they looked at it, it turned out that most of the diversion was diversion to individuals who wanted to access treatment with buprenorphine, but because of the limited access, which still exists, they couldn't get a hold of it. And anecdotally, I would say that probably over 50% of my new buprenorphine patients come to me already on black market buprenorphine, which they're getting for about $20 per 8 milligram. So there's a big profit margin there. And obviously, there are some individuals who diverted for the profit margin. Patient 24 milligrams of buprenorphine a day, and they're taking 8 milligrams and selling the rest. That's a huge profit margin. I think that is less likely than the former. Do they get high from it? An opioid naive person will get a high from it. Generally, patients use it as kind of a rescue medication. If they can't get their short-acting full agonist, they usually keep a little bupe on hand so that they don't go into florid withdrawal from their short-acting opioid.
Someone else is asking, do you have insurance issues? So I guess you had mentioned that Vivitrol or one of the other ones was very expensive.
Insurance issues. I'm not clear on whether that's liability insurance or otherwise.
I think they're talking more like coverage issues with the Vivitrol or some of your other choices. Does that indicate would you want somebody to methadone because somebody can't afford Vivitrol?
All right. So you have to understand that Meridian is, we do not actually accept standard third-party insurance. The majority of our patients who are insured via Medicaid. So we don't really run into the same third-party insurance that others do. And because of that, I really can't comment on what insurance covers for injectable naltrexone.
Okay. One of our students commented that he recently had an assignment where he had to look at a med list and work backwards to figure out indications. And it absolutely seems like community pharmacists are at a disadvantage. So he agrees that community pharmacists need a bit more information.
Okay.
Someone else is asking about, in a pregnant patient in a methadone program, once the child is born, does the child require a methadone weaning to avoid withdrawal?
That's changed a lot in the last few years as neonatal ICUs have become much more experienced in neonatal abstinence. And they used to use lots of either methadone or morphine in a tapering dosage. And they have found that by swaddling the baby, they've really been able to reduce that. So they're much less likely to use that. I think that Shands uses morphine. I know there were places that use methadone. Was that the full question, or did I cover that, or was there something else there?
Yeah, no, it was just, did the baby, I believe, need weaning?
Yeah. If you want a percentage, patients, pregnant patients that are on methadone, I would say that probably currently about 35 to 40% of their babies do require tapering pharmacotherapy. Buprenorphine It's been our experience and that of a lot of others, it's probably way down around 20 to 25%. So bupe has a much less significant neonatal abstinence. And one very important factor is that maternal dose of methadone has nothing to do with the degree of neonatal abstinence. And that's very important for patients because a lot of times they don't want to go up because they don't want to have their baby withdraw. And I always tell them that if they're uncomfortable because their dose is not high enough, that the baby is also being stressed out. So that's an issue that we deal with all the time.
Now there's a comment from a pharmacist, again, for our dialogue, that is coming from a chain type pharmacy who says she fills buprenorphine prescriptions, but other pharmacies have turned them away. Are you having any issues with only certain pharmacies filling some of your prescriptions, and and asking why you're using more of these drugs than other physicians or other practices?
Well, my practice is purely an addiction medicine practice. I don't generally prescribe, so I do have an interest in pain treatment, but I primarily use methadone and buprenorphine on a day-to-day basis. So that's why I use lots of buprenorphine. But the question is, I think, do patients have difficulty filling their prescription for buprenorphine? And the answer is a resounding yes in many cases. And patients, they have found pharmacies where they are known and where they can go. And it may not even be convenient for them to go to that pharmacy, but they know that the pharmacist knows them and they get their prescription. Now, I also have to say there's another factor involved with a lot of our patients. We tend to use a lot of the mono product versus the combo product. And the reason that we initially started to do that was the only combo product we had were Suboxone strips that were usually about $9 for an 8 milligram strip, whereas they can get a generic buprenorphine for, I don't know, $3 a piece. Since most of our patients don't have a lot of financial backing, we were using a lot of the mono product. And a lot of our patients, even though now we have generic strips and we have generic combo tabs, and the generic combo tabs are not a whole lot more than the mono product, there's still a lot of patients who are very hesitant to switch over to the combo product. I do have a lot of patients that report that they have headaches from the naloxone, which I used to think was kind of a bogus sort of thing. But I talked to somebody who knew a lot more chemistry than I did, and apparently naloxone is pretty chemically related to saccharin, and saccharin causes lots of headaches. And so I don't think it's bogus in a lot of cases now. And so we've run into that situation. There's a limited amount of mono buprenorphine out there. And I think that your suppliers are supplying less of the mono bupe. And I've also heard from pharmacists that regulatory agencies, AKA the DEA, has also suggested that perhaps you should be using more combo product than the mono product. So that's also been a difficult situation for a lot of our patients.
Yes. Another comment was that sometimes when the pharmacist calls a physician to ask a question about therapy, they are on hold a long time and generally never get to speak with the physician directly in a reasonable time frame.
I'm sure that's a problem. It's not a problem for me individually. I actually would love to hear from pharmacists. And occasionally when a pharmacist does call me, I have a great conversation. So yeah, I am sure it happens. And I'm sorry it does. If any of you guys call me, I'm very happy to talk to you. I'll give you my cell phone number too. So,
Awesome. And that goes into
it's usually not a problem, but yeah, I agree. It's a problem. Also, if just like you guys, if you're in a conversation with a patient and somebody calls you, you're generally not going to answer your cell phone. It's just not appropriate to probably do that. So, but yeah, I'm sure that problem exists. And again, it points out, how do we develop a more collaborative communication system, especially with retail pharmacies? I don't think it's much of a problem in an academic, hospital pharmacy.
And that's very similar to what Leslie's comment is. She says the basis of any collaboration is the communication between the entities. Therefore, knowing that the patient will use a specific pharmacy, it would seem best to call the pharmacy and speak with the pharmacist before prescribing a combination of medication and it arrives at the pharmacy. And so as a pharmacist or pharmacy technician, knowing what is coming and the why of it should make it easier for the pharmacist to fill the prescription for the patient and to consult with that patient about the goals of the combination. Fax is archaic, but instant communication to be used to set up speaking time regarding that drug combo and reason for the combo.
A very appropriate comment. I certainly do not disagree with that. And I think anytime you're, starting to prescribe a new combination of medications, it's always valuable to go over that. There are things that I miss or that I don't know. My electronic health record loves to, my e-prescribe loves to come up with a gazillion different interactions, which in reality probably don't exist. But yeah, I certainly could use some real world feedback. And again, how do we simplify or make that process more efficient? And is everybody on board with that? I'm on board with it, and I guess most of you folks are too, but there's always going to be outliers there. I'm not going to talk to the pharmacist because I'm the doctor, and we still hear that a lot. And the pharmacist saying, well, I don't want to talk to the doctor because he's not going to give me the time of day. So I think there's this kind of this ongoing tension that exists that we really need to overcome if we can, which probably was one of the most important points of this entire presentation.
And Jeff commented that the interoperability and centralized medical records have been talked a lot about without the necessary investments. So again, not having.
I could not agree more. Our electronic health record at Meridian is a very archaic, non-intuitive system. It is not Epic, okay? Epic is a dream compared to ours. So there's not intercommunication between various electronic, even one hospital having Epic and another hospital having Epic, if they're not in the same hospital system, they don't talk to each other either. So that's a very systemic problem for everybody.
At UF, our issue is a lot of times addiction and pain management is under the psychiatry banner, and they lock their notes behind the glass, they call it. And so we can't even see the notes. A lot of people don't have access to those notes to see what the goals of therapy are. Yeah,
so the UF system, I do have access to a read-only version of Epic. So I can look at the patient's firm shands and I can actually break the glass, but I basically have to sign my life away to break the glass. And I suspect, can you guys break the glass by giving a reason that you're breaking it?
I have not found that as a pharmacist, I have that access.
Oh, okay, interesting. Because as a clinician, not even being employed by UF, just being on the faculty, I can break the glass if I need to, but I have to give them a good reason, and they say, we are going to look and see who you are. And that's fine because I don't break the glass, but you are correct on that. Yep, it's a problem.
Someone else, Michael, asks, can you please speak about the disenfranchisement between technicians and pharmacists who steal narcotics because of an addiction? His research has shown that 99.4% of technicians lose their license permanently, but pharmacists in 99.8% of time get to retain their license and avoid conviction.
I do not have enough of a knowledge base on that to really comment. That's a regulatory issue, Department of Health, PRN, I guess the Department of Health, and I assume, is the pharmacy board under Department of Health, or is that a separate entity in Florida? I don't know, but I just basically can't comment on that. I don't know.
And a different Michael is asking, what about the patients who are allergic to Suboxone, but not to Subutex? Would love to hear Dr. Straubing's thoughts on this.
Okay, so allergy, I think, is a relative term. I do hear from patients that I'm allergic to Suboxone. And I always ask, what happens when you take Suboxone? Oh, I get a headache. I said, well, that's not necessarily an allergy, okay? I have had patients say, I break out in a rash. I've had a few patients say, I have difficulty breathing. And in those cases, I am going to write down patient is allergic to the combo product. Now, obviously, the combo product, the other part of the product is naloxone. Okay, so I have to assume that it's a naloxone component. I've actually gotten calls from pharmacies saying, you need to document the allergy. I said, well, I wrote down that they have an allergy. How do you want me to document it? Well, you have to prove they have an allergy. Now, I never recall writing a prescription for an antibiotic where somebody called me and said, before we give this antibiotic, we'd rather give a cheaper penicillin, but you have to prove they're allergic to it. And that puts me at, it's a conundrum. I said, what do? Do I give them a Suboxone, have them stand in front of me with my EpiPen ready? I don't know. And I have to, I'm sure there are some cases, maybe even more than a few cases, where the patient just doesn't want to use the combo product because they've been on the mono product. Maybe they're diverting, although I understand that the combo strip actually goes for more money on the street because people are sure they're getting the real deal. But it's a problem. I have written allergy, and or what I usually try and write in a little comment section on the e-prescribe is patient describes a rash when using the combo product.
Mm-hmm.
And do they really have a rash? I don't know. I have to take them at their word.
Leslie says, what is the main disadvantage of methadone maintenance?
Well, there's a few major disadvantages. There's patient disadvantages. Imagine having to go to a clinic every day and you only have between 6:30 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. to get your medication. And if you want to take a vacation, you have to line up either extra take-homes if the state will allow you to get them, or you have to arrange guest dosing at a clinic out of state. So from a patient standpoint, it's problematic. Methadone clinics, they're not most patients' favorite place to come to. There's a lot of stigma even among patients just walking into a methadone clinic. And a lot of patients experience a lot of stigma from other providers if they say they're on methadone. I've had patients actually turned away from treatment and they really needed a medical problem taken care of because they said they were on methadone, and the physician said, I don't take care of people that take methadone. So that's a downside for the patient. From a pharmacotherapeutic standpoint, I think there's a lot more side effects from potentially from methadone. It's much harder to titrate the dosage properly. I have to worry about a lot more drug-drug interactions with methadone. If I want to taper somebody off of methadone and move to buprenorphine, it's a very slow job, whereas I can go from buprenorphine on day 1 to methadone on day 2. I cannot do that with methadone. So there are a number of patient and physician shortcomings.
So Charlie just clarified for us that the Board of Pharmacy is under the Department of Health.
Yeah.
I feel like I should have known that, but I had blanked for there for a second.
I probably should have known it too, but you know, I don't keep up on, you know, a lot of the regulatory issues, and that's one of them. I don't know the answer to that.
And Lorraine made a comment that it sounds to me that having an on-site pharmacist as a liaison between your practice and a retail pharmacy would be beneficial. Of course, until and unless pharmacists can be reimbursed with their MPI numbers as healthcare practitioners in the eyes of CMS, this may not be feasible. Are you amenable to taking a pharmacist under your wing as a collaborative practice agreement colleague?
Absolutely. If Tim Rogers, who is our consultant pharmacist, wants to come into my office every day, I love to talk to Tom, and Tim is a good pharmacist, and it's just a problem of, as the questioner said, who's going to pay for it? You know, I don't know. And CMS, well, I don't want to comment on CMS, okay? But yeah, the money has to come from somewhere. I know when I was at Shands, yeah, frequently the pharmacists would make rounds with us, and the whole team. There was a team approach, and that's an academic setting, and that doesn't exist in the majority of clinical settings.
And Michael's asking, can a patient be kicked out of your practice? And if so, what are the parameters that would cause you to do that?
That's a really good question, and a question that I deal with. I get 2 new third-year med students every week, and I always ask them, I say, under what circumstances do you think I should discharge a patient? And I give the example of the patient who test positive every time for cocaine, let's say. And I've already talked to the patient 3 times about the danger of cocaine and methadone, et cetera. And I said, under what circumstances do you think I should discharge a patient? And I have to say that the med students at UF are pretty perceptive, because they say, I wouldn't do that. And that we don't do that. With the thinking of, if you look at addiction as a disease process, a patient who is using additional drugs is presenting with signs of their disease being very active. There are very few other physicians who discharge patients because they didn't stop smoking when they told them, their doc said better stop smoking, or they didn't follow their diet and their hemoglobin A1C is 14. They usually don't say, you know what, you're not making any progress, you're gone. So why do we discharge a patient? We primarily discharge a patient for significant behavioral issues. In other words, if you physically or verbally threaten either staff or another patient, you're not going to be in treatment anymore, okay, in our facility. And that's purely a safety issue. It's an interruption of the normal treatment milieu for the other patients. Short of that, it is very difficult to get, using the terminology, kicked out. And in fact, there are patients who are in my buprenorphine clinic that are outpatients, and they're not making any progress in an office-based setting. And I will talk to them, and they continue to make no progress to their own detriment. I don't kick them out. What I do say is, you know what, we need to up the intensity of our treatment, and we have a great place where I can increase the intensity, and that's right next door at my methadone clinic, where I can have you dose every day, and I can give you more intensive behavioral therapy. I will tell you that when I tell a patient that, I almost universally get, I'm not taking that methadone stuff. It rots my teeth or whatever. And so I don't kick them out. I do sometimes suggest, and in some cases mandate, a higher level of care.
So would proven diversion be a reason for you to ask them to leave your practice?
Proven diversion is very difficult to prove, unless a pharmacist calls me and say, you know, I just saw, I gave that patient 90 buprenorphine, and they walked right outside my pharmacy, and I saw them hand it to another guy and he handed him a bunch of cash. That's generally diversion, okay? I run into that very, very rarely. You guys probably more so than me. Diversion, I used to consider that, along with adulterated urine screens, as reasons that patient wasn't interested in treatment. I now sit down with the patient and say, what's the diversion about? If it's clear that the diversion was to supply buprenorphine to their relative who's been trying to get into a buprenorphine clinic, I'll say, okay, why don't we see your relative and we'll treat them. If it's purely for financial reasons, I generally will not treat them in my buprenorphine clinic because I do worry about the diversion. I'll, offer them the methadone clinic where there's much less diversion because patients are consuming their dose in front of us.
So we're getting lots of great comments that everyone's enjoying your presentation and they think you have a great knowledge base. Tim is asking, what is the goal, I guess the long-term goal with these patients? Is it to eventually decrease the dose of methadone or buprenorphine to 0? And what's the reality? Or is this like going to be long-term therapy that they're going to be on something forever? Another
super question. Nothing in medicine is always, okay? So, and I guess I get asked all the time, what's your goal in treatment? And my goal in treatment is to have my patients lead a happy life and a productive life and to reintegrate with society, okay? There are some patients that in order to do that, they need to stay on an agonist like methadone or buprenorphine, just like somebody needs to stay on their lisinopril for their hypertension or whatever diabetes drug they're on, okay? And there are some patients that come to me and say, hey, you know what? I've been on methadone for the last 5 years and I have a job and I've gotten back with my family and I just bought a car and all my drug screens are negative and I'd like to try coming off this stuff. And I say, great, let's try it. And what we do in those cases is to slowly taper the patient. So for instance, with methadone, I usually like to go down about 2 milligrams every 2 weeks and maybe slow it down when they get to a lower dose. And that gives them the chance to see, are they going to start to crave at a certain critical level? And that way we can stop that and say, no, you better not do that. Not a good idea. And it also allows us to just really do it on a very slow basis so they're less likely to have withdrawal. There are some patients who, because of pre-existing abnormalities that I already talked about early in the talk, in brain neurotransmitter levels, genetically, who will never, without some sort of help from us, get back to a normal level. Those individuals are more likely to really require long-term agonist therapy or naltrexone in the case of opioid, for opioid use disorder. I'm directing my comments towards that. But it's a really good question. And across the board, and I do have to say that statistically, there is about an 80% risk of relapse on opioids with individuals who stop either buprenorphine or methadone. But everybody's an individual. So those are the considerations.
So Michael is asking, is your practice full or are you still accepting patients?
Depends on which one you're talking about. Methadone, I have plenty of room. There's like no waiting. Buprenorphine, they're probably talking about. I personally don't have a lot of room. However, as I mentioned, we have about 6 providers who are taking new patients. So Meridian just instituted a thing where basically it's walk in and we'll take care of you, okay? It's not quite as simple as that, but yeah, there is room at Meridian for buprenorphine, and we do have 3 locations. We have, I'm not marketing Meridian, by the way, but so in Gainesville and we have one in Chiefland and one up in Lake City.
Justin is asking, is there a travel distance that would raise a red flag for you in treatment?
Not really. We do have some patients that come to us from Jacksonville, Jacksonville and St. Augustine, and generally those patients have been extremely upset. There's a couple of clinics that I don't, to be politically correct, I don't think they're the greatest clinics in the world, and patients pick up on that stuff. And they occasionally come, they'll drive all the way from Jacksonville. There are some situations where they were discharged from another clinic. So no, I don't have any particularly travel restrictions. I mean, I always keep track, like in the back of my mind, I always say, you know, is this going the way it should be? Am I worried about diversion? Because it is something that I do worry about. You know, it's not good.
And a comment came in just recently about that says, unfortunately, the only solution to stop diversion is to actually have traceable methods of drug distribution. You would be walking on very treacherous land if you had GPS tracking systems to make sure drugs intended for a patient are taken and eliminated by said patient.
Yeah, so that's really an interesting point, because occasionally at night I sit there and try and figure out a way of maybe tagging each pill, or tagging, somehow having some sort of time lock bottle that'll only open with a certain biometric or something. So if somebody could come up with that, like a biometric bottle at the pharmacy, you know, that you have to put your fingerprint on it and to open the bottle. You know, so yeah, that's yeah. When you start talking about GPS tracking and you know, you start getting into Big Brother stuff, and I don't know that we should be going there. Diversion for sure exists, and it's always going to exist. What I will mention, one thing that is done in certain places, and I would love to be able to do this, where I do have patients where kind of my level of trust may not be optimal with that patient, and they won't go to the methadone clinic. I would love a situation where I can say, you know what, you live in, let's say, Keystone Heights. You need to go to the pharmacy every day at Keystone Heights, and they will give you the buprenorphine that are prescribed, and they will dispense 1 pill a day to you. And I know that situation has been worked out in other states, and I don't know if there's any regulatory stuff. I don't know if there's corporate structure stuff that would prevent that, but quite honestly, that would be a great collaborative approach. And, you know, obviously, there's no reason the pharmacy should do that for free. So, you know, there could be a market for that. I think that'd be great to be able to do that. And in fact, in Canada, there are essentially no methadone clinics. A doctor in a methadone clinic prescribes methadone, and then they go to their local pharmacy, and the pharmacy dispenses methadone.
I actually worked in one of those pharmacies in Niagara Falls for 6 months
There you go.
before moving to Florida, so I am familiar.
Yeah, yeah.
We have one
How did
last
it work?
comment. Pardon?
How did it work?
How did it work? The patients came in. Now, all of our methadone was liquid. We made it from methadone powder into a 10 milligram per mil liquid, and then we diluted it with Tang down to 1 milligram per mil. And so the patient, we would get the order for the written prescription for the milligrams, whether it was 70 milligrams or 150 milligrams. And in the morning, I would pour their bottles, and then we would top it up with more Tang, and they had to drink it in front of me every day.
Okay. Did you find it burdensome to do that, as in addition to your other pharmacy work?
It was. We had about 30 patients that would come in every day. I think at max we would have 50 patients, and so on top of everything. But then very quickly they would let them have carries where they would have to drink one in front of me, and they'd get to take one home or get to take 2 home. So that's how it stayed about the 30 mark.
Yeah, and I can tell you're Canadian because you just said a boot.
Thank you. We have one last comment from Paul that says, if I find here, that in 1971, he volunteered as a pharmacy student in a shams-based methadone program And the clinic was held in, now is what, the outpatient pharmacy near the atrium.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't know that that happened. I think we're running out of time. So before we're totally done, because I'm not going to have time to. This has been great, by the way. But
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of this case that I presented to you guys. I wanted to tell you what happened when the patient's family brought these 2 prescriptions to a large chain pharmacy. The pharmacist on duty called the physician and said, you know, I really don't feel comfortable you giving both methadone and oxycodone, and I don't think that I want to do it for safety reasons. And the palliative care doctor explained this is something that she does very often, and even in a 92-year-old patient, 2.5 milligrams BID of methadone is very valuable. And the pharmacist said, let me consult with one of my colleagues, and she got back with the physician, and she says, no, we have decided based on our professional judgment that we are not going to prescribe these. So it was think how you all would have responded to it. I'd actually, if somebody can get back, maybe Joy, if you guys talk about it at all, I'm curious as to how other pharmacists would have approached this. I don't think it's a corporate decision, but rather an individual one. So I'll kind of leave it at that because it's 4 before 9. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Straubing. Bill, did you have any last announcements?
No last announcements, Dr. Straubing. It's a shame you didn't create any interest. We could probably ask questions for at least another hour if you're here. Are you available, you gave us your email at the beginning of the talk. Would you be willing to answer a few questions via email if some people had some extra
Yeah,
things
absolutely. How often do you guys meet?
Monthly.
We meet monthly.
If you want me to just kind of come back via Zoom or whatever and do questions, quite honestly, it's very for me to hear the sort of questions that you have, and also kind of jogs my knowledge when you have to kind of say it verbally what you're thinking. So yeah, I'd be very willing, or you guys can email me and I'll be happy to try and respond if I can.
I think we really enjoyed having you tonight. You clearly were somebody that's very knowledgeable and in the subject. And thank you so much for being with us. And everybody, make sure you fill out the evaluation. 911 is your code. Thank you very much again, Dr. Straubing, for being with us tonight.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Good night,
actually.
everybody.
Good
Oh,
night.
there's Michael. Michael, do you have any last announcements?
No, to Alachua County, that ends our webinar for today. Have a pleasant evening. We'll see you at your next meeting.
Thank you, everyone.